Hello, everyone. My name is Robert Winfree, and what you're about to listen to is an old episode of a podcast I used to host called Everyone Loves a Bad Guy. This particular episode features myself and Pat Mullin talking about the various incarnations of Dracula that have graced the screen and, to a slightly lesser extent, literature, since that character's inception, basically, back in the day with Bram Stoker. Now, this episode originally aired on July 18th, 2013. I bring that up only, and perhaps most importantly, because this was recorded before the, I'll be kind, ill-conceived Dracula Untold that was meant to kind of connect to uh, the at this point aborted uh, dark universe that Universal attempted to get off the ground with its classic monster villains revisiting their shared universe. They had a shared universe way back in the day. Frankenstein and the Wolfman squared off. Like, that was a thing. Shared universes, not as original as you might think. So that won't be discussed. It took place after the fact. We have a pretty good discussion here, touching on a bunch of different variations on Dracula. Well, that Dracula Untold movie, that really did kind of, if you'll pardon the pun, put a stake through the heart of that character in popular culture. There hasn't been a major Dracula movie since, which is kind of a shame. As you'll hear in our discussion, Dracula is an interesting character with a lot of different ways you can interpret him. But before I throw to that particular episode, let's pay a couple of bills. First up, in our sponsorship list, Grammarly is a sponsor of the W2M network here. For you listeners of Everyone Loves a Bad Guy's re-airing episodes, Grammarly is offering a free download of the Grammarly software. Grammarly's AI-powered products help people communicate more effectively. Grammarly helps you write mistake-free on Gmail, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and nearly anywhere else you write on the web. Grammarly corrects hundreds of grammar, punctuation, and spelling mistakes while also catching contextual errors, improving your vocabulary, and suggesting style improvements. If you're interested to download Grammarly today, go to getgrammarly.com/W2M network. Again, that's getgrammarly.com/W2M network to download Grammarly for free. If you do not wish to type that into a search bar, click the link below. There is a link in the description below this podcast/video. It's audio only, but it's on YouTube. So in the description, there's a link. If you're interested, give it a click. Grammarly is a very, very useful tool. I encourage you to try it. Our second sponsor is Amazon Music. Dracula has usually been associated with more classical organ music, even in some cases. So if you would like to peruse a large selection of songs, including stuff from any of the various movies that are discussed here in this podcast, Amazon Music has a library of over 70 million songs. If you want it, it's there. With almost, I mean, I can't say 100% because you'll find the one song and then get mad at me. But with that, a library that extensive, a great search function, and just the best, for my money, music streaming service available right now. If you're interested in having a free 30 days on us, you pay nothing and you get 30 days of this wonderful service. Get AmazonMusic.com/W2M network. There's a link as well in the description below. Fill out the little survey it's not a survey really. So let them know that we sent you there. That helps us, that helps Amazon, and that helps you get 30 days of the best music streaming on the internet for free. After that, if you like it, keep it. If not, you've lost nothing. You have only gained. There's no downside to this particular offer. So give that a click if you are so inclined. And with that out of the way, myself and Pat Mullin back in the year 2013 talking about Dracula. Take it away, fellas.
When the devil is too busy and death a bit too much, they Call on me by name, you see, for my special touch. To the gentlemen, I'm misfortune. To the ladies, I'm surprise. But call me by any name, anyway, it's all the same. I'm the fly in your suit, I'm the pebble in your shoe, I'm the bee beneath your bed, I'm the bump on every head, I'm the heel on which you slip, I'm the pin in every head, I'm the thorn in your side, makes you wiggle and ride. And it's so easy when you're evil. This is the life you see, the devil tips his hat to me. I do it all because I'm evil, and I do it all for free. Your tears are all the pay I'll ever need.
Yes, we only need your tears. Well, in some cases, blood. But we're going to get to that in just a moment. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am your host, Robert Winfree, here on Everyone Loves a Villain. Yes, I did change the name for this particular episode for a pretty specific reason. You see, to me, a bad guy isn't always necessarily evil. That's why they're so much fun, because there can be some redeeming qualities in them. And they can fall into a lot of different categories. For example, when we talked about the Hulk and the Hulk's enemies and the James Bond villains, there's a lot of them, so they're all just kind of bad guys. When you're talking about one specific entity, in this particular case, the most prolific, well-known villain of all time in the form of Dracula, it's a villain. It's just the one guy, so I altered the title just a little bit to kind of reflect my feelings. Also, I'm kind of lazy, so you never know which way I want to. But yeah, as I just said, tonight we're talking Dracula. Most iconic, most discussed, most recognizable villain in the history of villains. Everyone knows Dracula. But I'm not alone on this one, thankfully. Although in an ironic twist, the podcast I did by myself on Hannibal Lecter still has the most listens as far as this particular series goes, and all of the Radulich broadcasting shows for the last several months. Ha, I got you all beat. By myself. Maybe I don't need anyone. Interesting thought. But I do have a guest here. He was here last week when we talked about other vampires, all non-Dracula vampires, the good, the bad, and the ugly. He insisted on coming here for Dracula. He made threats against my person if I didn't invite him onto this particular episode. So please welcome back Pat Mullin. How you doing there, Pat?
Not always proud, but I'm always loud.
Well, you're from New York, right? That kind of goes without saying.
Yes, indeed. Happy to be
All
co-piloting this journey on the Demeter.
Oh, good. I'm glad to have you. You and I share similar tastes in a lot of things, and it's nice, but we can also disagree without degenerating into a shouting match at each other for 15 minutes. So, you insisted on being here for Dracula. When did you get exposed to Dracula? What was your first kind of exposure? How did you come to enjoy the character? Give us a brief dissertation on how you came to your position as far as Dracula specifically is concerned.
I think, like most people, the first exposure you have to him is as a kid watching, certain iterations of monster movies. And the fact of the matter is there's so many interpretations of Dracula through so many actors that it's almost impossible not to see a Dracula movie if you're into movies at all by the time you're, 5 or 6 years old, depending on how much leeway your parents give you with what you watch or watch it with you. And, that was the case. The first Dracula movie I'd ever seen was featuring Bela Lugosi in the title role, and from there it snowballed into kind of every other iteration there was. From there it spun off into the Marvel Comics series Tomb of Dracula that ran for 70-plus issues, and then I actually, when I was older, I could read the actual original Dracula novel by Bram Stoker, and kind of all these different, various ways he's popped up in the Castlevania video game series, and he's crossed hats with almost every literary hero in the public domain that you can imagine, and some that aren't, from Sherlock Holmes to Solomon Kane to even the X-Men. So it's pretty hard not to get caught up in Dracula at some point if you're just, aware of pop culture at all.
I believe he had a series of comic books with Batman trying to catch him, which is great.
Yeah, they even published a series with Batman. It's a trilogy they did called the Batman Blood Trilogy, where I believe the first one was Batman, Dracula, Red Rain, and they did 3 volumes of it.
I think that's a great contrast to have Batman and Dracula, especially that particular version where he's trying to capture him because, Dracula kills people and drinks their blood because he's a bad guy, folks. For as many times as he's been portrayed in other movies by other actors as a tragic romantic hero, he's a bad guy. He's the guy who'll tear your throat out if you... Now, I first read the novel by Stoker before I got into too many of the books, or the other movies. I was aware of his presence. I'd seen him, but I absolutely love that book. I mean, the way it's formatted as a series of journal entries and letters is just, it's a great format for it. It's paced very well. There's a couple of things in there that, as far as vampire lore, have been kind of left by the wayside over the years, and in some cases for better. I mean, like we discussed last time, that a vampire can only, they can't cross running water, or the tide has to be going in or out just some odd things that he put in there that, again, have kind of fallen out of favor because they're so bizarre, but the main stuff is still there, the garlic and the wolf's bane and the shape-shifting, the sunlight. Although Dracula can actually be in sunlight, he's just significantly depowered. I absolutely love the book. It's one of my all-time favorites. I could reread it. If I had one book to read forever, that would be high on my list.
Without a doubt. And actually, the first time I read Dracula, I had taken out Dracula's novel from the library, and I took out Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And, Dracula is just so much better written than, I could say about Frankenstein. I thought the actual novel Frankenstein was a mess and just a chore to get through. Dracula was a delight, and so I really got hooked from that point on. This is the character I'm going to go to.
I do enjoy Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I love the story. I agree that as far as how it's written, there are some issues, but to anyone who's just seen the Universal monster movies with Boris Karloff as the creature, they're nothing like the book. The book is actually kind of heart-wrenching when you get into it, and I like that too, but as far as just what I'd like to read, I much prefer reading Dracula. Now, after a brief history lesson, Dracula was published, became a big success pretty much right away. I mean, that wasn't one of those novels that sat around for years and collected dust like Moby Dick did. I mean, there are tons of stories of authors that have their greatest work discovered posthumously, and thankfully Dracula wasn't quite that bad as far as being discovered goes, but the Stoker estate had a copyright on Dracula and all of its properties and rights, and actually one of the films we talked about last week, Nosferatu, which features Count Orlok, who's basically Dracula, but they changed a couple of names and a few locations and said it wasn't Dracula. The Stoker estate sued. They won. All the existing copies were supposed to be destroyed. Thankfully, they weren't because, again, Nosferatu is a great movie. But the first approved version, as far as movies go, that we got was the Universal version, which starred Bela Lugosi in the title role. Now, crazy bit of trivia for you all out there. Bela Lugosi played Count Dracula twice. He's best remembered for that role. He's the go-to depiction of that role. Still, after all these years, the quintessential Dracula, he played the role twice. And one of those was in the comedy Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, or I believe it's Meet Frankenstein and the Wolfman. Great comedy. I saw it when I was a kid. I absolutely loved it. It's a great comedy movie. But here was a guy who played this role a grand total of 2 times and remains years and years later. The original came out in the 1920s, and here it is, 2013. He's still the go-to Dracula. That's amazing to me. So, Pat, your thoughts on? Let's just stick with the 1927 Dracula movie and Lugosi's version of Dracula.
Yeah, and I know that initially Lugosi, he got started in the role on the stage play that they had done prior to the film, and he wasn't initially the choice to be cast in the movie until he did the reading, and really what won them over was his accent, because they felt like this added something so different to the character that they wanted to keep him. And I think that the Dracula film, as a film for its time, especially with the effects portion of it, is kind of an overlooked gem in this day and age where everything we have with CGI. Everybody who's seen the movie knows the spiderweb scene where Dracula welcomes Renfield to his castle, and Dracula walks up this flight of stairs and seemingly passes directly through a huge spiderweb, and Renfield tries to do the same and, of course, gets caught up in it. And such a great effect, but The movie as a whole is not completely faithful to the novel, but I think what they did was
misses the whole third act. As far as if we're going 1-to-1, there is no third act from the book to the movie as far as that one is concerned.
Yeah, and for a movie, it's relatively short in length. It's under 90-minute runtime. It's barely over an hour, really. But it does a good job of taking the best parts of the books that they could do at the time and putting them on the film. Yes, some characters were omitted. Some characters were condensed into one, as a combination of two or more characters being put into one role. But ultimately, Lugosi's portrayal is what's always remembered best about that movie, and for good reason, because he really found a way to charm you as this evil, menacing character and put fear into you, despite the fact that at the time they never showed him with fangs, they never showed him actually feeding or showed blood on the screen. Lugosi's presence as an actor really brought that character to visual life for people for the first time. And that's why I think, even though he's only played the role twice, he's really the guy that the majority of people think of. When they think of Dracula, they don't think of the novel or some other actors who've played him. It's Bela Lugosi with the widow's peak hair, the dinner suit, and the accent, good evening. That's all they see.
And it's absolutely true, and it's kind of the guy was buried, at his own request, mind you, he was buried wearing the cape of Dracula. And it's an absolute crying shame that the last movie he ever appeared in was Plan 9 from Outer Space, which is historically one of the worst movies ever. And Lugosi in other horror films can be he's still quite an intimidating presence. He's still, White Zombie, where he plays the zombified voodoo master. He plays not a bad guy, I forget the title of the movie, but one in Technicolor where he's got a little person as his sidekick, and the story's being narrated by a woman who's dead and on the slab, and it deals a lot with hypnosis. It's a fun movie, but he's still remembered as Dracula, and it's amazing that when you consider all the other iterations. When I talked about Hannibal Lecter, I talked about there have only been a few other people besides Anthony Hopkins to play the role, and he's still the definitive one. But, again, Silence of the Lambs came out in 1992, if memory serves me, and so it hasn't been, going on 100 years, and we're still talking about Anthony Hopkins as Hannibal Lecter. I think we will, but that's a different issue. The point here is it has been almost 100 years, and we still think of Bela Lugosi. Despite, Dracula is, the character of Dracula is in the realm of public domain. Anybody can use him however they want to, and sometimes it's been very, very, very bad. There are some bad versions of Dracula that we're going to get to in just a minute here. But it's still all about Bela Lugosi. Now, I'm just curious, do you think that has to do with, just in this case, just being the first, being the one that everyone remembers, or was, in your opinion, was he just that good in the role? I feel he was just that good in the role of Dracula that if Bela Lugosi were alive today and they cast him as Dracula, they could do it, and you could even get, the kind of the graphic and bloody effects that we get nowadays in film, and he'd still probably be the best Dracula. That's my 2 cents. I'm curious as to your opinion.
I think it's a little bit of combination of both. I absolutely do think he was marvelous in the role, and all the praise that he's gotten for it over the years is well-deserved. But I do think it was a bigger deal, to people because it was the first time they were doing a licensed portrayal of Dracula, and it was really the first time it was brought out. I do think that stands to help his cause as to why people remember him. It was a Universal picture, which means it's one of the biggest studios around at the time. It's the definitive monster movie studio in the United States during the golden era of the Universal monster films. And it's Dracula. It's the name of it. There's no other Dracula film just titled Dracula that's had the impact or the lasting effect of that. It's the definitive film for a lot of people for that reason. Whenever you say, I want to rent Dracula, you're talking about the Bela Lugosi Dracula film, and that's what everybody points to. But I do think that a lot of it does have to do with... To be fair, it took me...
I had someone hand me the 1979 version, or 82 version with Frank Langella once.
One time, but, whenever you say I want to rent Dracula...
I want to touch on that later when we talk about good versions of Dracula, because I enjoyed it, but, yeah, they're going to give you the Bela Lugosi version most of the time.
Yeah, the clerk at the video store is going to hand you the black and white film with Bela Lugosi and Dwight Fry and tell you have a good night. But Lugosi has such a magnetism in that performance and really just kind of no pun intended, sunk his teeth into that role to such an effect that he stayed with people for that reason. Where, and I agree, even if he wasn't the first guy playing it, his iteration would still be amongst the very best, if not the best, because of how well he did in that role and made it his own. To the point where other actors who've played the role have really they haven't really played Dracula so much as they've tried to play Lugosi playing Dracula, is the best way to say it, I guess.
Oh, that's a very common complaint with a great portrayal like that one. I mean, I hate to bring it up again, but I mentioned a couple of times when talking about Hannibal Lecter that as far as, in particular, Gaspard Ulliel, who played young Hannibal in Hannibal Rising, it seemed like he was playing a caricature. It seemed like he was doing he was trying to play a young Anthony Hopkins playing Dracula, as opposed to, again, I apologize for backtracking here, but Mads Mikkelsen on television is playing Hannibal Lecter. It's not Anthony Hopkins' Hannibal Lecter, it's his own version. But so often, when you have a great role like that and a great performance, you don't get guys doing their own version of it. You get people, I mean, I believe I mentioned this before, but when it was announced that The Office was becoming a U.S. series after the British one had found so much success, a lot of the people who auditioned for the role of Michael Scott were not trying to play Michael Scott. They were doing a Ricky Gervais impersonation, playing the boss from the British series, the BBC version of the series. And it's a credit to those actors who are able to do something different with the role. They're not just playing Lugosi playing Dracula. And sometimes that comes off very good, and sometimes it comes off very bad. And we'll get to the very bad in just a minute here. But again, just when you have a great performance like that, it is so difficult for an actor at times not to just be Lugosi being Dracula, but to actually be Dracula. And since we're talking about bad versions, and one in particular I want to talk about as far as it seems like someone playing Bela Lugosi playing Dracula, I have such a love-hate relationship with this movie. I mean, it's crazy when you think about it, but, what year was it? I got the list here. You think I can find it? Okay, in 2004, there was a movie released called Van Helsing. Stars Hugh Jackman in the titular role of Van Helsing. It's done by the same people who brought us The Mummy and The Mummy Returns, a couple of my favorite, just action movies of all time. Unfortunately, their version of Dracula is just so bad. Richard Roxburgh is just over the top. He's aping Lugosi's accent. He has no menace at all to him, and it's such a huge, because here's Dracula who's supposed to be scary. He's actually trying to unleash his children to conquer the world, and there's no sense of menace. There's no sense of anything really that comes out of him other than he's Dracula, so he's what Van Helsing is hunting. I mean, I don't know, you've probably seen it. I mean, we've seen a lot of movies and sometimes bad ones. In this particular case, I love watching that movie as just kind of a popcorn movie, but as a fan of Dracula or werewolves or Frankenstein in some cases, it's just no, bad movie. But, feel free to, help me lambaste that particular performance, because I have nothing good to say about it.
Yeah, I don't off the top of my head recall Richard Roxburgh and much else, but and that's maybe intentional on my part, because after seeing him butcher the role of Dracula and Van Helsing, it was
the only other thing that I recall with him off the top of my head was he played the number 2, the number 1 henchman for Dougray Scott's character in the second Mission Impossible. But that's it.
And again, not really a memorable performance for the right reasons in that movie by anyone, but that's another podcast for another day. But yeah, with the Mummy series, they tried to turn it into more of an action genre film because they felt that they wouldn't sell the horror quite as well in the present day and age, and that was the initial thought behind Van Helsing. And what you got the result there is it's trying to be half action movie, half homage to the Universal monsters. But what it does is it really mocks the Universal monster film franchise, and people who are fans of it certainly by no means were happy with the portrayals of the Wolfman and the Frankenstein monster, and even the title character of Van Helsing himself with Hugh Jackman, who's a terrific actor. But the Richard Roxburgh performance of Dracula is really a bad caricature of all of the previous Draculas we've seen, kind of rolled into one with Lugosi having the most heavy influence on it, and not in a good way. There's been some bad portrayals of Dracula over the years. That one's certainly very close to the top of the list. because it's so hammy is the best word I can use. It's really clearly not taken seriously at all, and he almost plays a comic book bad guy from the Silver Age in the 60s where he has to spell out every line of his master plan before going ahead with it, and you're almost waiting for the sound effects of Bam, Pow, and Biff to come in whenever there's an action scene with him. It was meant to be more fun for the action genre. It came off as very camp and hammy in the performance and just not enjoyable at all, really, for me.
I mean, as far as just like being a popcorn movie that I can watch and kind of turn your brain off, to use that particular expression, which I'm not always a fan of, but I don't hate it as far as that goes. I mean, for the same reason, I can enjoy the Roland Emmerich version of Godzilla. As long as I don't think of it as a Godzilla movie, I can kind of enjoy it. When I think of it as a Godzilla movie, it pisses me off to no end. But that same time frame, that just the 2000s have not been a very good year for Dracula. The whole decade is just not. You don't get a whole lot of good stuff coming out of here. I mean, the other one I want to talk about specifically as far as bad versions go, and this has more to do with the movie itself than necessarily Dracula's portrayal in it, but the version of Dracula portrayed by Dominic Purcell in the 2004 movie Blade Trinity, that movie is just so bad on so many levels. I mean, we mocked it a bit last week, but I want you to kind of have a field day with this one for a minute here. Tell me what you hate, what you don't like about that, and since, again, we're specifically talking about Dracula, touch on that particular character as well.
Well, my dislike for that goes even deeper than your average Dracula fan because, like I said, part of what I got into with Dracula were the Tomb of Dracula comic book series from Marvel Comics, which the Blade series is taken from. And in terms of the source material, at one point, one of the main characters was a character named Frank Drake, who is a modern-day descendant of the Count and is part of the crew that tries to hunt him down and look for him. Dracula uses the name Drake as a modern-day alias. But really, in this movie, part of the charm of Dracula, to a lesser extent, and we talk about, yes, he is a complete villain, but part of the charm of him is that he's such a dynamic personality and has such a presence. Dominic Purcell is a good actor. Prison Break was a very good series in its early stages, mostly due to his performance.
I actually discovered, I don't mean to cut you off there, but I agree. I mean, until they started getting into the conspiracy and all of that stuff that really just kind of drug the show down. And Wentworth Miller, I felt, was a big part of that. But I actually discovered Dominic Purcell on the one-season run of the television show John Doe, which I'm a sucker for kind of oddball, suspense, supernatural-ish television shows. I mean, I grew up watching The X-Files, so, even short-lived stuff like Miracles or Millennium. I mean, I'm name-dropping some odd ones there, but you get what I mean. So I enjoyed that show. I was sad when it was canceled, and you're right, he's a fine actor, and I apologize for kind of cutting you off there. So resume your point.
No worries. And he's a fine actor, but for a lot of the movie, they have him very solemn and brooding and not really the focal point of what's going on. It seems like he is more about making faces and menacing gestures, but they never really give him a chance to shine. And at the rare points they do, the movie is kind of all over the place in respect to the characters and giving them a chance to break through in certain scenes and gain some momentum with the audience. And anytime it almost looked to the point where Dracula's character would get something going in the movie in terms of drawing you in with interest, they'd immediately cut the legs out from under him, be it with either bad dialogue courtesy of David Goyer, who is very hit and miss, or just bad direction with jump cutting to another scene. And it almost felt like a complete waste of the character, particularly the final encounter between himself, Blade, the Hunters, referred to as the Night Stalkers.
It's got Ryan Reynolds in it. It can't be good. That's just kind of my opinion as far as that goes. Believe it or not, that's the reason I'm not seeing R.I.P.D. over the weekend, is because I don't like Ryan Reynolds. And not even the awesomeness of Jeff Bridges can overcompensate. I actually liked the basic thought process behind Dracula removed himself from the world because he was disgusted with how people live. And it's an interesting premise as far as the character goes, because for him to have become disgusted with people, thousands of years ago, you can only imagine how he'd feel coming into modern society and walking by. I mean, I actually really like that scene when he's walking into the shop that sells all Dracula merchandise, and he's just kind of looking around, and it's just like, what the hell happened here? But I agree. They never let the character, kind of generate any momentum. I mean, the sequence when he's holding the baby on the rooftop, talking to Blade, and just the way he kind of mentions that, well, perhaps the next time we meet, you will kill me. And then he just kind of gets this, but I really don't think so. And then he tosses the baby at Blade. And there's just no follow-up, like you said, with any of that. And it's so sad because you could have gotten such a better movie out of just increasing Dracula. Because, one of the reasons I started this is that, a hero's only as good as his villain. A great hero with a bad villain becomes forgettable. I mean, and that holds true across, all kinds of mediums. I mean, Superman has Lex Luthor, which we talked about for 2 hours. His bad guys and why Luthor gets remembered so much. Dusty Rhodes had Ric Flair and the Four Horsemen, and that's still remembered fondly for a reason. And I mean with that one, Blade becomes less interesting because you've got kind of a weak version of Dracula. Hugh Jackman's Van Helsing is less interesting because Richard Roxburgh's Dracula is so bad. And it's a real sad thing when you have something like that. I mean, if you have Dracula in a movie, a lot's riding on Dracula. It just kind of by the nature of the beast. And when you have someone, be it the actor or the director or the writing, that can't hold up to that, everything else suffers. It doesn't just, I mean, it's not like, oh, it was bad, but other things can make up for it. If that's bad, everything else suffers a lot. And that's a big thing for me as far as a good villain is what makes a movie or a franchise or anything like that. And, when you've got, when you have people like that and you have movies like that, it hurts. And it hurts a lot as far as just the overall presentation of the product. It's not good. So we've heard a couple of mine that I absolutely dislike. How about you? What versions of Dracula spring to your mind that make you go, God, I wish they had not let this slip into public domain because now any idiot with a camera can make a Dracula movie. Did I lose you there? Yeah, I lost him. Hang on, Pat will be right back. There he is. Sorry, do you need me to repeat any of that? You dropped for a second there.
No, I heard you pretty clear, Robert. And
okay,
just
sorry
before
about
I get
that.
into not a problem. And just before I get into my point about a bad Dracula portrayal, one of the points you made is a hero being only as interesting as the villain, as long as the villain can hold up their end. Dracula is one of the few villains who's really more known than his arch nemesis, whereas everybody knows Sherlock Holmes, not everybody knows Moriarty. Everybody knows Dracula, not everybody really knows Van Helsing, or whichever iteration of Van Helsing he's battling at the time. And so it's so important to give him that leeway to work with, and, Blade Trinity just shat all over that. But as far as bad iterations of Dracula go, we touched on some, but in 2000, Wes Craven presented Dracula 2000, and I think there was potential there for the story. Rather than go with the established story of Dracula being Vlad Tepes the Impaler, they went another way and kind of alluded to Dracula being Judas Iscariot, who had betrayed Jesus Christ, and that would explain why he was so hated, why he had such a hatred for religion, specifically Christianity, and why silver affected him so much, because if you don't know the story, Judas Iscariot betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, so silver tends to be very symbolic in certain instances. But the problem is they don't ever really try to establish that fact hard until the last 5 seconds of the movie or so, and even then it's not
they make a lot of the other movie about the main characters trying to figure out why he's averse to silver or who he really is, or who he was before he became Dracula. That's why, who was it who played the original Van Helsing in that movie? Give me a second, let me click the button here. Great actor. I can't remember his name off the top of my head. Why can't I? Christopher Plummer. Jeez, you'd think I'd remember Christopher Plummer of all people. But now he plays the aged Abraham Van Helsing, who's keeping himself alive by injecting blood that leeches have pulled out of Dracula to find who he is so he can eventually kill him. And, I actually didn't dislike Gerard Butler in the role of Dracula. I'm personally a huge fan of Gerard Butler's. I mean, yeah, for some, I mean, that's not one of those things I can necessarily explain off the top of my head, but I'm a big fan of the guy. I actually went back and watched Dracula 2000 just because I found out it was him that played Dracula in that particular movie. And the movie itself is just, it kind of iterates or hammers home that Wes Craven is kind of hit or miss as far as what he chooses to present, and the director, Patrick Lussier, is, well, I don't think much, but anyway, continue your point. I apologize. I keep cutting you off.
Yeah, and for a movie about Dracula, they don't give him all that much screen time in it. It's more focused on Van Helsing's estranged daughter, who, and her friend, who are kind of filling in the roles to an extent of Mina Murray and Lucy Harker from the original novel. To an extent, they're kind of their spiritual predecessors. They never really go into explaining how Dracula can pick up, where Van Helsing's daughter is and how he shares a mental bond with her, because apparently the blood that Dracula can touch from somebody leads him to track whoever is a direct blood descendant of them in some kind of weird, odd way. I have no idea how that works. They don't actually bother trying to explain it. They don't bother to try explaining how, the Abraham Van Helsing character knows what he knows. It's very mishmash, very all over the place. And Dracula himself is very much an enigma in the film, which, Dracula is always an enigma in films to some extent, but one that you know enough about. In this one, they're very all over the place with the mythos of the vampires and what works, what doesn't, and there's just no consistency. And because of that, your main antagonist to the movie is who's really the central character of the film, gets nothing to work with. And aside from a few good killing scenes, there's not much scenery that Dracula has in this movie worth watching. And that's a shame, because Gerard Butler as Dracula on paper is a home run.
Yeah, I was really disappointed as far as how the movie was constructed and presented. Speaking of bad versions, we would be remiss not to mention the utter dreck that is Dracula 3000.
Speaking of spiritual predecessors.
Go ahead, hit. Okay, it sucks so bad that it's been said that, by comparison, any other movie looks better. I've seen it, and one of the things that bugs me about it is, first of all, they call the movie Dracula 3000, and yet we don't get Dracula, we get Count Orlok as the main vampire. That whole movie is just so bad from start to finish. You
would
can
think
tell
there'd be some way to enjoy a movie about vampires featuring Coolio and Tiny Zeus Lister. No, there's not.
You'd think, but no, there's just nothing. There's nothing redeemable about that entire movie.
Yeah, even Erika Eleniak, who was a total babe back in the day, had fallen on hard times and wasn't the prize to look at like she was just some years ago.
Yeah, that whole movie, you get so little Dracula in that. It seemed like they were just trying to essentially copy the formula of the movie Alien, where you bring the evil thing on board, it slowly stalks and kills everyone, so you don't have to see it all that much. But, the fact that this movie took its inspiration from Alien almost makes me wish Alien wasn't made, and I love that movie, just so we didn't have this. That's how bad I consider it.
That movie was Alien meets Leprechaun in Space meets Jason X, and what resulted out of a one-night drunken, ecstasy-filled romp.
Oh, it must be, because it's exponentially less watchable than any of those combined.
And I would 2 out of 3 of those are just not very good, to say the least.
Yeah, I'd rather watch Warwick Davis in space than anything to do with this movie, which is just sad. And I love Warwick Davis. As an actor, I think he's a very good actor. Not to just because he's a little person.
No, Willow's fantastic, and a lot of that's to do with him. But, again, you can only do so much with what they give you.
Yeah. And, Jason X is not a very good slasher movie, especially not a good Jason movie, but there's some campy fun to be had there, I feel. But Jason will be the subject of a much longer podcast, probably sometime in October. I'll be during the month of October. I'll be guest spotting on Long Road to Ruin with Sean Comer, discussing the Hellraiser franchise while Mark Radlich takes a vacation. And during that time, I'm going to try and get him on here to talk about Freddy, Jason, Michael Myers, all the big horror icons and whatnot. So I have very little doubt that we will be discussing Jason X again, and not in pleasant terms. There's not a whole lot that's good about it. But, and just one more that I almost hate to bring up because I so love Jack Palance, but Jack Palance played Dracula in a 1973 movie, Bram Stoker's Dracula. And that, to me, is just such an odd casting choice for Jack Palance to be Dracula. I mean, that's almost as bad as, that's got to be like one of those epically bad casting choices, like John Wayne as Genghis Khan. Or, I forget who they got to play, who was it? Whoever they got to play Che Guevara in the first biopic that they made about him was just these horribly bad casting decisions. I mean, the 1973... Yeah, go ahead, sorry. Go ahead.
I think the thought process is that Jack Palance, while he's a terrific actor, can be a scary man to look at without any effects. He's a very intimidating guy because, A, he's so big, and B, he just has a hard face that looks like, it's had a small mine shaft being blown up on it. And so they put fangs on him and immediately feel that Jack Palance with fangs will be even scarier than normal Jack Palance.
Yeah, it just, I don't know, that whole thing, part of the problem was, first of all, as much as I love the works of Richard Matheson, he kind of suffers when he writes screenplays. I feel the same way about Thomas Harris. I felt a big problem with Hannibal Rising, the movie, was that they got him to write the screenplay in addition to the novel.
I think Richard Matheson works better when he's left to his own devices to work with his own mythology and characters that he's created. When he's taking somebody else's work and has to modify it, I don't think the end product is what it should be.
Well, to be fair, that is one. They also, you mentioned that they went to the effort of making Jack Palance, who's, like you said, an intimidating guy. Here's Jack Palance being scary, and they try to paint him as a tragic character instead of an evil character, and it just, I suppose if you want to know...
Jack Palance cry until that moment, and that's an image that scares you for all the wrong reasons.
Jack Palance should never cry. He sweats from his eyes. I mean, come on, people. But if you want to know kind of how that particular thing came about, it was produced by Dan Curtis, who also produced the original Dark Shadows. So that,
and
if that explains any of where the... Sorry, go ahead.
And The Night Stalker with Richard Matheson, another vampire movie.
Yeah, but it explains kind of where his thought process is as far as that goes. Well, unless I think of something else that's really bad between now and the end of... Oh, wait, I do need one more that's just campy and bad. There's a couple of these, actually. We touched on The Fearless Vampire Killers, directed by Roman Polanski last week, and Ferdy Mayne as Dracula. Well, he's not actually Dracula, he's Count von Kroklock. But, which is a play on Count Orlok, who was actually Dracula. The argument can be made that all vampires are essentially Dracula. But the other one, I think we should touch briefly on Ferdy Mayne's admittedly humorous performance in Fearless Vampire Killers and the rather bizarre turn that John Carradine took in Billy the Kid versus Dracula. So, your thoughts on either of them?
Dracula. Oh my God! Billy the Kid versus Dracula. Oh, bringing me back to the days of TNT's Monster Vision with Joe Bob Briggs.
Oh yeah, I'm going old school.
It's shown as a double feature usually, along with Jesse James Meets Frankenstein's Daughter.
Naturally.
But yeah, John Carradine is another guy who's a fine actor, but I think he looked at this movie as something that was as ludicrous as it could get, and just decided to have just a blast doing this. He looked like he was drunk in a couple of scenes. Maybe they wanted that to be bloodlust, but it looked as if he'd had a few glasses of Merlot before the scene was shot. And one of the things I remember more than anything from that movie about it is that at random times when Dracula was about to feed, he would have just glaring red eyes, and then they would just cut away and not actually show you the good stuff.
The budget was too low. They couldn't afford to show you the good stuff.
Yeah, and just, again, Weird Western is its own genre where they have a ton of movies along those lines. But
who could forget the
John
classic
Carradine,
that was... Oh, what was it? It'll come to me in a minute. Keep going. I'll figure out what I was thinking of.
John Carradine as the top-hatted, goatee Dracula, kind of, he looked very much the part of a Snidely Whiplash as opposed to a Dracula, which hurt him a little bit in my eyes. And granted, the movie is supposed to be a campy, fun movie in the vein of Batman, the 60s TV series, but
or Batman
I don't
and
know
Robin.
that there's a whole... or Batman and Robin, but I don't know that there's a whole lot of redeemable qualities to that movie other than, geez, this is bad, but it's only to the point where you can watch about the first 15 minutes or so before you're like, this is just a waste of my time. It's not even entertaining bad anymore.
Yeah, and in that same vein, released in 1957, The Blood of Dracula, which was basically, this was done by the same people that did I Was a Teenage Werewolf. The film was basically I Was a Teenage Dracula, and it just makes your skin crawl to think about it.
And it didn't even have Michael Landon.
I know, I mean, come on.
Who was, of course, the teenage werewolf.
He could have been one of only two people to play the werewolf and Dracula, because Lon Chaney Jr. also played the son of Dracula in the titled movie, Son of Dracula.
Who winds up being Dracula anyway? Spoiler alert, sorry.
Yeah, the movie came out in, 1943?
Yes.
We're spoiling a movie that's older than most of the people listening.
Yes, but, even more of a chance that they haven't seen it at that point, because today's culture has no tolerance for culture of the past and works of art such as Son of Dracula, where he uses the clever alias Alucard, which is, I believe, the first time in anything they use the name Alucard as an alias for Dracula.
And it goes on to become the Son of Dracula. Other iterations of Dracula use that as an alias. It's a pretty big deal. And yeah, there are some good ones in there. And to your point about John Carradine, we talked about him.
He looks more Snidely Whiplash than Dracula. I can't get over that.
He actually had a couple of good turns as Dracula in House of Frankenstein and House of Dracula. I mean, he's actually a pretty good... He's a talented actor, and when given the right material, he produced a pretty decent Dracula. But, I suppose even actors have to get paychecks every now.
You know what's interesting is he played a role on the 70s detective series McCloud, and I'm really dating myself on that one. Dennis Weaver played the title character McCloud. In one episode, there's a rash of serial killings that look to be the work of a vampire, and there's a man claiming to be Count Dracula, played by John Carradine. And to be honest, I enjoy him in that episode of McCloud more than any of his turns in film, because I think they let good doing, just using veteran acting techniques from the real older methods of the talented vaudeville days that you don't see anymore, and just can chew up scenery, but in a good way.
Yeah, an actor, we use the phrase scene chewing as a negative 9 times out of 10 because it seems like people don't know how to do it properly anymore. I mean, if you look at Jack Nicholson in the 1989 Batman, he chews all kinds of scenery, but it's in a good way. It's a memorable way, as opposed to, guys who just chew scenery because they're hungry. I mean, I say kind of the same thing. I mean, you can say kind of the same thing about Anthony Hopkins as Odin in the first Thor movie. He chews some scenery, but it's not in a detracting way necessarily. It is kind of a lost art to chew scenery and better the movie because of it, be a detriment. And since we've talked about all the bad versions, we have to talk about the good portrayals of Dracula. Now, the one we touched on briefly that I want to touch on again here, the 1979 version with Frank Langella as Dracula, it's a bit more just like a remake of the 1931 Dracula, but I actually really liked Langella as Dracula. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, I like Frank Langella. I first saw him... Okay, this might be a bit of an odd phrase, you got to bear with me here for a minute, but he plays the bad guy in the movie Cutthroat Island, which to date I believe is the biggest box office flop of all time for a variety of reasons. One of them I feel being that the studio, Coral Co., which was in charge of distribution and promotion, was already in bankruptcy at the time and couldn't put effort into promoting it, and the movie unfairly, it killed the pirate genre as a movie genre until Johnny Depp and Captain Jack Sparrow came around in Pirates of the Caribbean, Curse of the Black Pearl. But he plays the villain in that, and I actually really like that movie. I mean, I think it has an unfair bad rap as being the biggest flop of all time because it's far from the worst movie. But that's where I first discovered Frank Langella, and him as Dracula, I really enjoyed it. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, Frank Langella, they made that movie and had Dracula really kind of back to his roots in a way after a lot of the portrayals of Dracula through the 50s, 60s, and 70s had kind of taken him further and further away from the novel's depiction. Some in good ways, some in bad ways, but with Frank Langella, they wanted to get the character back to his roots and really kind of almost explore more with him than what they had allowed previously to the more relaxed moral climate in 1979 and there was in 1931. And so not only is Frank Langella very good at terrifying you and being this crazy force of nature that you don't think is ever going to be stopped, he's also a very overtly sexual character. And to be honest, the way they have him play that role in the movie, I think only adds to the predatory nature of Dracula as a character. So I was really on board with what they did, even though, you know, some people claim it's to attract more of a female audience. Well, no shit, Sherlock, but it also stays true to the character's nature of being a hunter and predator. And so I really loved the way they added that element to the character. And, you know, Frank Langella is a great actor, and when you give a great actor a great role and focus on that role in the movie the way you're supposed to, you're going to get good results. And to me, you know, the best scene in that film is very much towards the end. And again, spoiler alert, we shouldn't have to say it. You should know that by now. We have to talk about these things. But when they are on the when, you know, Parker and Van Helsing have got him in the ship and they encounter him in the hull and they pull out a cross to, you know, kind of bear him away, Dracula just wraps his hand around the cross and immediately sets it to flames because he's such a force of nature that they completely doubt their own abilities to fight him. And it shows that because the way those objects of faith will work against Dracula or other vampires of myth is that it's the faith the wielder has in the object. Their faith is so shaken by his presence that he can grab hold of it and set it aflames right in their hand is amazing. And Dracula, you know, given a lot of leeway in the movie because they know what Frank Langella can do, where he can in 1 minute have, you know, women going crazy for him, and in the next minute have them screaming and running out of the aisles because he goes from 0 to 60 from the sensual kind of predator that some women get off on to the guy who's going to rip people's throats out with his teeth and enjoy every minute of it.
Yeah, that particular cross sequence is also one of my favorite parts of the movie, the book. I haven't actually seen the movie yet. I need to, but of Salem's Lot features the priest Father Callahan confronting Barlow, and he's got this cross made of like tongue depressors or something like that he made, and it starts out very.
That he's holding up.
Yeah, it starts out bright and strong, and it pushes Barlow back, but Barlow just keeps talking to him and intimidating him until his own faith is so shaken that it loses all of its power, and he then turns him into a vampire and sends him on his way, where he meets
Go ahead,
his fate
Shaman. Throw down your cross. Throw down your cross, Shaman.
Where he goes on his merry way to meet his eventual fate in the Song of Susanna, for those of you who read the Dark Tower series. But, okay, since we're talking good ones, we have to talk, I mean, we can't not talk about Christopher Lee. I mean, that would just be such a huge disservice to all things Dracula to not talk about Christopher Lee. Now, you and I tend to have kind of similar tastes as far as this goes. Christopher Lee does kind of the same things that Frank Langella did in the 79 version much earlier, in that he'll go from being the, you know, tall operatic voice, you know, kind of draw you in with kindness Dracula to bloodshot eyes and giant fangs at the drop of a hat, and it's absolutely terrifying in a lot of ways to see Christopher Lee as Dracula. So you kind of came up on the Hammer films. I want to hear what you have your thoughts on Christopher Lee as Dracula.
I owe so many sleepless nights to Christopher Lee as Dracula, sitting in my bed holding my rosary beads as a kid, just, you know, in total fear that this guy was going to be knocking on my window looking to snack on me. And maybe that shows that my dad wasn't exactly the most responsible of parents to have me watching these movies at the ages of 6 and 7, on my own, mind you. But yeah, Christopher Lee, to me, was the definitive Dracula for me. He played him in Hammer Films' 7-film series, which started with Horror of Dracula, that was released in 1958, and stretched through into The Satanic Rites of Dracula, which I believe was released in 1973. And over the course of those 15 years, he
actually did one more. I don't know if you've seen it or not. It looks like it was pretty bad, but The Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires in 74.
Yeah, that's a loose one that technically is not part of the same series. That involves 7, you know, not ninja brothers, but 7 gifted martial arts brothers fighting against 7 vampires of lore led by the Dracula character, who isn't really the Dracula. It's very complicated and not very good, unfortunately. But the Hammer films, to me, were the definitive Dracula series, and the majority of that has to do with Christopher Lee's portrayal of the Count. And the initial film Horror of Dracula is in many ways the same movie that they made with Bela Lugosi. They incorporate a little bit more from the novel into it, like the character of Arthur Holmwood, who's portrayed by Michael Gough, who would best be known as Alfred in the Tim Burton Batman films. And it also introduces the definitive portrayal of Van Helsing by Peter Cushing, who is, forever tied to Christopher Lee because of these films, because of the Sherlock Holmes films, because of the Frankenstein, because of how much they work together,
They're
how great they work together.
Yeah, they're such a great pairing. That's one of the great acting pairs of all time, I feel. You get Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing together. Even when Christopher Lee was just being the fully bandaged mummy and Peter Cushing is shooting him with a shotgun.
Yeah, instant chemistry between the two of them no matter what, and the studio knew it was money because those guys were so good together. But Christopher Lee's Dracula really encompasses everything that you want to see in Dracula over each of the films. And the films make such an effort to incorporate the mythology from Bram Stoker's novel and further it into those movies. The Horror of Dracula is what kicked it off. Now, in that movie, they changed the ending a bit, whereas in the novel, they killed Dracula with the use of a Bowie knife. In this one, Van Helsing is smart enough to feign that he's been knocked out or choked unconscious by Dracula, forms a cross out of 2 silver candlesticks, and exposes Dracula to direct sunlight and turns him to dust. Dracula returns in Prince of Darkness, and this is a kind of a 180, where Dracula is just a feral, animalistic creature who hardly speaks, yet he's such a presence that he's immediately got women seduced when he runs into them, and is a ruthless killer when he encounters anybody trying to stand in his way. And in a lot of ways, that's kind of the definitive portrayal of the character for me, is Dracula, Prince of Darkness, which I believe was released in 1966, if I'm not mistaken.
That's what it says here.
Yeah, and that was actually a film without Cushing as his protagonist. And so really that film fell completely on the shoulders of Christopher Lee. And he just slam dunked it, and I've never seen a better portrayal before or since, including his other works, where you have films like Dracula Has Risen from the Grave is his next one, and that's also sans Cushing. And Scars of Dracula, which is actually the first film that they do with Dracula that shows him scaling the walls of castles and buildings like he does in the novel.
Which is one of the creepier aspects of Dracula. I mean, I was happy when they did it with Frank Langella in the 79 version because you see him he just crawls. I mean, it's like Spider-Man, but, it's evil. It's just another... go ahead. Imagine
the visual of those, those bloodshot eyes, completely red, just crawling up, is sitting outside your window staring in at you. Not exactly the most comforting of visuals.
No, it isn't.
And really, unfortunately, a lot of people, were not aware of the full mythology of the character. They hadn't read the novel. They had only seen the movies. So for that first iteration, for them to see that for the first time, of this guy scaling the walls, as if he was Spider-Man, just another bit of terror added to the whole package.
Yeah, Christopher Lee was able to tap into the feral, the animalistic, the pure predator side of Dracula that hasn't really been done well since then. The next one I want to talk about specifically is the Francis Ford Coppola version, Bram Stoker's Dracula, which features a phenomenal cast with Gary Oldman as Dracula, Anthony Hopkins as Van Helsing, Keanu Reeves as bored-faced Jonathan Harker, Winona Ryder as Mina. It's a great cast. It's a really good movie that I enjoy, but what you get in that movies and a lot of other ones, they don't get the hunter, they don't get the predator, they don't get this guy will tear your throat out without a second thought, really, that you get with especially Christopher Lee doing it. I mean, that version of the guy who will just kill everything in sight because he feels like it is just kind of lost in the modern world of, Twilight and Anne Rice and all of the other young adult pop culture appeal to teenage girls, vampires. Vampire fiction that we have.
Yeah, and even going back to Horror of Dracula, which is Lee's first portrayal of the character. In the very beginning of the movie, when Jonathan Harker arrives at Castle Dracula, And at one point, a bride of Dracula comes and tries to bite him, and Dracula fends her off. I was scared to death the first time I saw it. I was probably about 7 years old, 6 or 7 years old, and I'm, covering my eyes while my dad's sitting there on the couch laughing at me. And I'm, telling him to tell me when it's all right, when I can look. And so he says, I say, can I look now? And he goes, yes. And I uncover my eyes, and I see these blood red eyes and this, blood-stained mouth, and I've been scarred ever since.
Your father pulled a Bart Simpson on you.
I prefer to think of it as Bart Simpson rips off my dad, but,
Either way. So if you would talk for a little bit about the Gary Oldman version that we see in the 1992 Francis Ford Coppola movie. He's portrayed as the tragic hero in that, and kind of instead of the villain, and that you get a lot of that lately. We talked, appealing to the masses, and the reality that young adult fiction and teenage girls make up, teenage girls and middle-aged girls who are single, middle-aged women, they make up a large amount of market share as far as the world goes. So portraying vampires in a light that appeals to them, you're immediately going after a large percentage of the population. And so I'm just curious what you felt about Gary Oldman's version of Dracula. Personally, my favorite part about that one of my favorite parts is that they actually correctly display him aging backwards, which is a big theme from the novel. He starts out when Harker meets him first in Transylvania. He's a very old man. He looks very much like, he's very insect-like. For those of you who've seen Nosferatu, he resembles Count Orlok. He's this very old, kind of broken-down man, and then as he feeds and as he becomes stronger and he becomes younger, he looks more fit, his hair goes from gray to black, his skin tight, he just ages backwards, and it was really nice. I mean, Christopher Lee actually did a version, I forget which one, that had him aging backwards as well, but it was really nice someone touch on that particular aspect of it. So what were your thoughts on that movie in general, and again, specifically kind of Gary Oldman?
I think Gary Oldman is arguably the best actor of his generation, and he's capable of pulling anything off because he's one of those guys who commits so fully to a role, and he's willing to do and try anything to make it work. And I do think he did a great job in, Bram Stoker's Dracula with the portrayal of that. And, to be in such a powerful ensemble cast and to still be pointed out as the focal point says a lot about how well you did in the eyes of your public. The aging backwards process was something that they never really did a full justice to in any movie. They tried it and kind of done minor versions of it here and there, but they really went full bore with the effects. And to see Oldman, look so different throughout is kind of the staple of his career because he's always been something of a chameleon with adapting his look to the look of the character, going to, various extremes. And you pointed out he has an almost insect-like appearance to start with. He's got the chalky white skin, and he looks as though he's 90 years old.
The much mocked and played upon that big hair, that two-part.
Yeah, the
big
hair wig.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he looks as though if you poke him, he's going to crumble to dust. But as they gradually have him feeding and his appearance keeps changing, he gets younger looking, gets more athletic looking, grows the longer hair, the goatee, starts wearing the glasses and the dignified clothing, and he really kind of supersedes the scenery and everything else going on because you're so focused on him. And that's a credit to Gary Oldman's magnetism and his understanding of the role and what it required. A lot of the art of playing Dracula, and we've seen it from the guys who did it the best, is subtlety in your motions and subtlety in your movements because you're the focal point. So you don't have to be out there and, outrageous. You can do things in a very simple, subtle manner, and everyone will still pay attention to you. And it'll make you stand out as opposed to the guys who have to, have their arms extended outward and tape flailing in every scene. And that's what one of the strengths of Oldman's portrayal was more than anything. And to be honest, my favorite scene from that movie actually is not one of him doing a true vampire sequence, but when they show him transforming into a wolf for the first time in London. And the way it's shot is very beautiful and very different from any other way they've shown it. But Oldman really succeeded despite anybody else, and I think even if he didn't have that star-studded cast with Anthony Hopkins with, you know, even Keanu Reeves, who was still trying at that point, and Winona Ryder.
Yeah.
I think the movie
You know, we make
still
jokes
would have
about
been good.
him, jokes about Keanu Reeves being, you know, wooden-faced and the woodpecker can land on his head, and he just, comes by every now and then. I mean, there was a time in his career when he was, you know, putting forth effort, when he was a prospect, when he was thought of very well, and this was actually during that time. So, you know, he was actually a contribution to this movie rather than a detriment.
Yeah, but I think even without everybody there, the movie still would have worked just because of how good Gary Oldman was and because of his understanding of how to portray the character and do it justice, which hadn't been seen at that point really since Frank Langella had played him, and that was, you know, almost 15 years prior to that.
The only one that, that one came out in 92. The Frank Langella version came out in 79. And between then, you had a lot of comedic roles as far as Dracula was concerned. I mean, you had, we're going to get into some of these that you might categorize as bad, but because they're Dracula in kind of comedic roles, I think you have to kind of look at them in a different way. Between 79 with Frank Langella and 92 with Gary Oldman,
Are we going to bring up the Monster Squad?
Yes, because the Monster Squad came out in the 80s. You also had the romantic comedy Love at First Bite with George Hamilton. And not too long after, so filmed about the same time, more or less, as Bram Stoker's Dracula, you had the Dracula Dead and Loving It with Leslie Nielsen. So kind of a mixed bag there, but let's go ahead, since it came out first, let's go ahead and start with Dracula Dead and Loving It with George Hamilton in the romantic comedy spoof. How'd you feel about the deep pan of George Hamilton? I mean, even in a comedy, George Hamilton taking on Count Dracula.
That's the intentional cheap laugh right there, is you get an actor who's more well-known than anything for his tan, and what do you get him to play? A guy who can't move around in the sunlight. Perfect. It works. Let's go with it. And it's just so initially surreal at that point that you know this is not a movie you're going to have to think a lot about during. Dracula at this point is resurrected during the disco era and falls in love with a disco model hostess named Cindy Sundown is her name, played by Susan St. James. Her on-again, off-again boyfriend / psychiatrist, Jeffrey, is seen as a nut and a kook because he believes the guy is Dracula and that he's going to turn Cindy into a vampire, and he won't let that happen. It kind of does a good job of giving you an idea of what would really happen if somebody was trying to tell you that there's a vampire loose, and especially if it was Count Dracula, what the reaction would be to them. You would laugh at them, look at them like an idiot, and want them locked up in a rubber room. And it's well, some would consider it bad because George Hamilton kind of does his best Bela Lugosi impression and gets the cheap laughs in. It's a lot of fun, and I don't have a problem with this movie at all. It's made specifically for laughs. If you don't understand that just by the casting of George Hamilton as Dracula, I have no reason to speak to you. But it's fun. It was to capitalize on the Dracula craze that Frank Langella started. Okay, they had a big hit. Let's make a laugh about it. You see it in Hollywood all the time. This was no different, and I thought it was a blast.
It's one of the pitfalls of something being in public domain is that you do get a lot of comedy that can fall into that character, and it's not that Dracula can't be funny. And I personally have no problem with Love at First Bite or Dead and Loving It with Leslie Nielsen because I'm a Mel Brooks sucker. I mean, not everything he's ever done I find to be amusing and good for a laugh, but a lot of it I find very funny, and I don't have a problem with Dracula being used in a comedy movie because it happens to everybody, you know? I mean, you can take a character like Dracula and you can use them in a comedic movie because, in part because they're so entrenched, especially at that point, as being, kind of a bad guy. Well, here, let's have some fun with it. And I thought it worked as being funny. I mean, if you can't have a sense of humor about things like that, then what's the point? I mean, I'm a huge fan of zombies. I laugh like crazy at Shaun of the Dead to this day. I mean, you have to, even these things that you love, and even if you love them for being, the opposite of a comedic setting, you have to have, if it's done right, it can be quite funny. I mean, that's one of the things that I love about Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein. You have all of these, I mean, you have an all-star cast there. You have Bela Lugosi back as Dracula. You have, of course, the comedic genius of Abbott and Costello. You have Lon Chaney Jr. as Larry Talbot, the Wolfman. And you get all of these hilarious situations, but you never see the monsters being mocked. You know, you never see the Wolfman take a pie to the face. And when you can do it correctly, it can be so funny. And that's one of the things that, stuff like Love at First Sight or Dead and Loving It managed to do. They don't mock it. They have fun with it without mocking it. And there's a big difference between, what's the tagline from one of the Botchamania films? The subtle difference between laughing at and laughing with. And you can laugh with Dracula, as long as you're not really laughing at him. So, since we just mentioned it, what do you think about Dracula Dead and Loving It? I mean, I'm a huge fan of Mel Brooks' comedy, so you kind of know where I sit as far as that one goes. And Leslie Nielsen playing Dracula was just hilarious for all the wrong reasons in some ways, but I still get a kick out of it.
Yeah, Leslie Nielsen was an interesting choice. I watching the movie, you get it because Leslie Nielsen was so good with just absurd humor in Police Squad and the Naked Gun films, and even slapstick stuff he can get through. I think the real underscored star of that movie was Peter MacNicol as Renfield. Just any scene he's in, you will die laughing. And to be honest, his portrayal of Renfield is very much accurate from the novel and from Dwight Frye's performance in the original Dracula film. It's just amped up to the point with the physical comedy taking the absurdity of it to another level. But, again, a good tongue-in-cheek laugh at the right aspects of what makes the character unintentionally funny at times. And it's the art of not depreciating the character while making you laugh with the character. That's the key to doing it. And Mel Brooks has done great spoofs before, so it was in capable hands. You look at movies like Blazing Saddles, which spoofs the Westerns, and, History of the World. Young Frankenstein, which he had done, 20 years earlier in the same manner.
One of my all-time
and again,
favorites.
Brilliant. Again, just a brilliant movie with, the right leading guy for the part. And, in one case it was Leslie Nielsen, who's a proven comic genius, and the other was Gene Wilder, another proven comic genius.
But, come on, I saw that movie for Peter Boyle as the creature.
Also,
no,
very much deserving of praise.
No, I'm lying. I watched that entire movie for the 5-minute segment with Gene Hackman as the blind priest.
Cigars!
Where you going? I was going to make espresso.
Yeah, but again, Mel Brooks' capable hands. The director of Love at First Bite knew exactly what to do. These are iterations where you're not depreciating, is the best word I can think of, the characters involved. You're getting fans of the character to have fun with them that they don't normally get to have, because you can't be serious all the time. You have to sit back and have a laugh. And if you can do that with a character you love and you're invested in, why not? And these are movies that are proof that it's popular and so loved that it can last through comedy iterations and still have a loyal fan following.
Well, it can go through comedy iterations and still come back and be an absolutely terrifying character when handled properly. Same time frame, more or less, we would be remiss not to mention the 1980s cult classic The Monster Squad with Duncan Regger as Dracula. Confession time for me, I've seen Monster Squad once. I was at a family reunion in New Mexico. We were just hanging out, watching some movies. Somebody put it in. Never seen it before, never heard of it before. Okay, comedy is a very subjective thing, first and foremost. I think everyone is aware of that. I don't have a lot of tolerance personally for stupid things, which is a dangerous thing in today's society because stupidity abounds. So watching that in the beginning, it was very hard for me to kind of get a read on it, for me to decide, okay, is this going to be good or bad? I mean, kind of like if you see, it gets compared a lot to The Goonies, and it falls into that same kind of tonal movie. It took me a while for me to understand kind of how the movie was playing itself, and at that point I started enjoying it, but if I'd known more about it, I mean, if I found a copy and watched it again today, I'd probably enjoy it more than I did then, but a lot of people I said that when I said about, The Lost Boys, with Kiefer Sutherland and as the vampire, and everybody kind of goes, oh man, that's such a great vampire movie, I love everything about it, and my response has always been, I can understand why you feel that way. I have to disagree with you. a lot of people love Monster Squad, and I think a lot of that has to do with seeing it as kind of a young, you see it when you're at an impressionable age, and it's such a fun movie for younger kids that it sticks with you. And when you become older, you still have kind of the rose-colored glasses as far as it goes, and that's not a bad thing. I'm not trying to be negative about it here. But it just, so, again, when I first saw it, it played really weird, and I had a hard time, and it wasn't, there were a couple of sequences where, because Dracula is still the bad guy despite all of the other, you got every other major monster ever in this particular film, and Dracula's the one in charge of all of them, so he's still, it was just really hard for me to get a read on it, so I probably didn't enjoy it as much as I could have. I want your impressions of that movie on the whole, and in particular that version of Dracula.
Yeah, you kind of stole my thunder, because I was, what I was going to say is there's a certain appeal that movies have when you do see them at a younger age that you always retain some kind of a fondness for them because you remember how much fun you had watching it as a kid. And I think this is definitely a movie that defines that. I saw this when I was very young, probably about 7 years old, and I had a blast while I was watching it as a kid. So, they rarely ever play it on TV. It just got released on DVD for the first time a few years ago after, and versions of the videotape were trading on eBay for like $100, $125 a pop, which kind of, it's a limited print, which on one hand, but it also explains the popularity it had amongst tape traders. And I think a lot of the fun to be had,
popular.
I think a lot of the fun to be had is if you're a kid seeing this movie, because it's not really an overly serious movie. And the problem is it doesn't straddle the line too well between what it wants to be, whether it wants to be a serious monster movie or whether it wants to be a Goonies type movie. And like there's scenes in it where they're the team of kids who refer to themselves as the Monster Squad are accosted by the Wolfman, and the token fat kid of the group, Horace, kicks the Wolfman in the crotch and hurts him. And the quote of the movie is,
Wolfman
has nards. Yeah. And that's fun when you look back on it, but when you see it for the first time, if you're, above the age of 13 seeing this movie, it's not really going to have that same effect. And I think that's part of the thing why not everybody takes to this movie. I'm a huge fan of Duncan Regehr from the time he was playing Zorro on television in the early 90s, the late 80s, because I was a huge fan of that show growing up, and I've always loved the Zorro character.
We're on the same page there.
What was that?
We're on the same page there. Zorro's one of my all-time favorites. I used to watch the old black and white reruns when I was a kid that had Zorro in it, and one of my favorite movies of all time to this day is Mask of Zorro with Anthony Hopkins and Antonio Banderas. Yeah,
and that's where I initially knew the guy who was playing Dracula from. I was like, this is Zorro, this is Duncan Regehr, because he had played him for years on the Family Channel, which has now evolved over several iterations into ABC Family, but he was best known for playing Zorro on television, and it's him playing Dracula. And I don't think he was a bad Dracula by any means. I think he played a different kind of Dracula because in the movie there was a very specific agenda involved with his character where he wanted to open a portal to allow all the monsters dominion over the world so they could rule and the humans would be subjected to their rule and they could do whatever they like. So it's very much, he has one direction to go with. There's not a whole lot of other things for him to do, like vampirize an entire town or anything like that. But I think his performance kind of gets lost in the mix here because he's playing the role straight in a movie that doesn't have any balance between its comedy and its terror, or lack thereof in many cases. The Wolfman movie becomes enough.
For me, one of the issues was, like you touched on, the tone of the movie. You have the fat teenager, young teenager, who kicks the Wolfman in the crotch and is able to incapacitate it. A few minutes later, you have Dracula walking blissfully through town square, ripping out, killing police officers left and right. You're like, wait a minute,
Yeah.
It's just kind of awkward at times as far as that goes.
Yeah, the team directing this and producing this didn't really have a clear goal in mind as to whether they really wanted to make it a laugh or really wanted to make it a good horror movie with a couple of tense-breaking moments where it's not as serious all the time and you're not on the edge of your seat the whole time. You kept some rest in there, for lack of a better term. They break it up a little bit. Duncan Regehr plays the part of Dracula, with a very odd agenda for the Dracula character in most of his iterations. He's, like we said, he's trying to use this amulet to open a portal to allow all the monsters to come through and control the earth. That's really his whole purpose, and there's not a lot of other things for him to do in the movie He doesn't have a tremendous amount of screen time. And what's otherwise is a fair, there's nothing bad about his performance, I felt, but the movie itself doesn't do him any favors. And as a result, he kind of gets lost in the shuffle without ever getting to really have the chance to shine or fail if given the opportunity, because it's just never presented to him, because the tone of the movie is so all over the place.
And blending horror and comedy together very well is such a difficult thing to do. I mean, I'll freely admit one of the movies that kind of like that as far as horror comedies go that I will always look back on with rose-colored glasses, and I can, to this day, watch, and I think it blends them very well, and that's the movie Tremors, which, to this day, I can watch that movie loop to loop. I can actually quote almost the whole dialogue of it from start to finish, and I can just enjoy it, and it seems like that movie was, again, you're trying to find the right tone for it, and it's very difficult to hit horror comedy right. And when you have people that do it and do it well, it's genius. I mean, Young Frankenstein, again, more of a comedy than a horror, but it takes the horror essences and just makes them comedic. Shaun of the Dead, Army of Darkness, and to some extent Evil Dead 2, Dead by Dawn. Again, when it's done right, it's great, but when it's done poorly, elements of it really, really suffer. And I think it's a credit to most of the people involved with Monster Squad that despite elements of it being really poor, it has, people still remember it. It still to some degree, it still stands up.
Yeah, and I'll always have, a special spot in my heart for that movie because I enjoyed it so much as a kid. The same way I enjoyed movies like, you can show some of these movies to your buddies when you're older, and you're like, no, you never saw this movie. Come on, you got to see it. It's great. It's great. It's great. And you play it for them, but they weren't there at the time and the place that you were when you saw it, so it doesn't have that same appeal. I'm lucky enough to the point where it had that appeal for me, and so I can enjoy it for what it is and look back on it fondly. But I can certainly understand why a lot of people wouldn't be able to.
Yeah, like I said, if I were to watch it again, I could probably get more enjoyment out of it than I did the first time, just because I wasn't familiar enough with everything going on with it. But there are some movies that you love, that are like that you love in spite of their flaws, and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, to all the Monster Squad fans out there, and I know there's a lot of you, we're not bashing the movie, we're not trying to ape on it or anything. There's nothing wrong with liking that particular movie. I mean, there are some things that if you say you like, I will roll my eyes and think that your contributions to the human gene pool should be removed. That's not one of them. You're safe liking that movie. There's nothing really wrong with it. It just could have been better in a lot of ways, and I'm actually surprised they haven't tried to remake it at this point.
There's always been rumblings, like once they did the Fright Night remake, that they thought this was going to follow, and it hasn't. And I think part of that is because there's an apprehension that it's going to have the same effect that people who watch the older version of it now and don't get that warm, fuzzy feeling because they didn't see it as kids. I think that's the main apprehension about it, and that, the horror genre, the way it's evolved over the past 20 years, it's a very different kind of film market now in terms of what you can put out there successfully.
Yeah, if they were to, I'd go so far as to say this, even if you took the original Monster Squad as it sits now and gave it a re-release in theaters, and you put it up there against Random Saw number 37, Random Saw number 37 would probably do better financial. And that's a sad statement to both what people are willing to pay to see and how far the Saw series fell, because I love the first two a great deal, but they all just went downhill so much after that. But the whole Saw series is a different topic, even though I absolutely love Tobin Bell and his portrayal of Jigsaw, which I will get into at some point on one of these. All right, we've got 30 minutes left. There are still some other versions of Dracula that I want to discuss with Pat, but to anyone listening live, I'm not sure how many of you there are, if we've missed something, if you disagree, if you have a different point of view, first time ever, I'm going to open this particular show up to call-ins. If you wish to call in, fair warning, Pat, if you wish to flee early, I will understand, because you'll also avoid me giving you grief about your comic book podcast, which is going to be a running joke until it gets off the ground, just like part one of my Terminator series, which is coming at some point. If anyone wishes to call in, and feel free to tell us we're wrong, give us your different opinion. I ask that you have a minimum of profanity. If you choose to call in, the number is 323-657-0901. If you're listening to a recorded version of this and you think we're wrong, feel free to leave messages, comments. I welcome criticism as long as it's constructive. If you want to say something, if you think we're off base, if you have a version of Dracula that we haven't touched on yet and you want to get out there, I'm looking at the board right now. The number again, 323-657-0901. Give us a call and we'll see how this goes. First time I'm going to try this out as letting people call in for this one.
Yeah, you've invited a maelstrom of villagers carrying torches to chase us off is what you've done.
Hey, you know what? I'm willing to give it a shot. I mean, what's the worst that can happen? People keep calling in and they keep leaving them on mute. I have the power here, people.
Robert, you love bad guys, but you say something like, what's the worst that could happen? Don't you know what that opens us up to?
Oh, believe me, I do.
Next thing you're going to say is, we'll be right back.
We'll be right back. I'm off to go drink some beer and have sex and break all of the rules so that everything bad that could possibly happen to us will. I swear, when I do one of these things on slashers, I have to also talk about Ghostface, even though he's been 8 different people. So other versions of Dracula, I'm curious as to I'm going to take serious issue with this one, this particular version. I believe it's the 4th or 5th season of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, has an episode where Buffy meets Dracula. I cannot stand that interpretation of Dracula. To me, it is everything that is wrong with vampires in general and Dracula portrayals in particular. And, I mean, at that point, Joss Whedon, when he wants to, has a masterful touch as far as poking fun, at the same time giving credit to things that come from the past, like Dracula, like other vampire movies, other monster movies. That version of Dracula was so wrong, as far as I'm concerned, that it's just so bad for my money as far as the Dracula portrayal goes. I mean, I want to get your thoughts on that, Pat. What do have you seen that episode? Do you have any thoughts? Am I way off base?
No, I think you're pretty much dead on. When I actually first saw the episode when it first aired, I was still watching Buffy as it was live at the time. Still watched the whole series run. Still watch it from time to time on Netflix when I need something to watch.
It's great to kill 40 minutes, most of it.
Yeah, and I think this is an episode where maybe Whedon had been kind of pestered by people. This is called Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and you still haven't brought in Dracula. Why haven't you done Dracula? Why haven't you done Dracula? I think this is Whedon kind of just telling everybody, you want Dracula? Here, I'm going to give you a lame, horrid Dracula so that you never ask to see him again. And that's pretty much what we got. The fact that a castle appears out of nowhere in Sunnydale and seemingly no one is bothered by this, it kind of gets shed light on towards the end of the show's run why that happens, but, at the time it's very silly. They really try to take things backward and take every bad stereotype from previous Dracula portrayals possible and have him, just as kind of this is almost Twilight Dracula before there was a Twilight in many ways, because he seems less concerned with raising hell and having a bloody good time as usual, and more concerned with moving very in slow motion, like doing the Axl Rose snake dance whenever he's on screen, and trying to do sexy faces with pouty lips. And at no point do you really take this guy seriously. The whole idea with him drinking from Buffy and her willingly allowing it is kind of surreal and stupid in a lot of ways. I know a lot of fans of the show complained about that because Buffy's supposed to be a strong, independent female character, and yet she lets somebody drink from her again. And the repeated stakings at the end where he, in the Whedonverse, when you stake a vampire, it immediately crumbles to dust, whereas Dracula is able to completely reform himself immediately after, and Buffy just stakes him again, and as he's about to reform again, she says, I'm standing right here, and he just kind of drifts away, and it never goes anywhere. Nothing positive comes out of it. I blame Joss Whedon for Twilight.
Well, that's an interesting point of view. But, Joss Whedon,
for as many vampires doing the Axl Rose snake dance.
For as many good things as Joss Whedon has put out there, and he's put, I love Avengers, I love Angel, I really love the movie Cabin in the Woods. For as many good things as he's done, he's also, Firefly and Serenity, both very good. Then you got to counterbalance that with seasons 4, 6, and 7 of Buffy, Dollhouse. there's some really good stuff, but when he misses, boy, does he miss hard. I mean, that's just, yeah, you hit it right on the head. That was like the Twilight vampire Dracula before Twilight came out, and it's just such an odd portrayal. I mean, just all the way around.
I will say, I never cared for the Xander character in that show. That was one episode where he actually amused me when he was turned into basically pseudo Renfield.
Yeah, that might have been one of the episodes where Nicholas Brendan's twin was subbing for him, because that's the only explanation I can come up with Nicholas Brendan being tolerable. I actually did sub for him in a couple of those when he was sick or something, and they had an episode where he played evil version of Xander. I mean, personally, I was kind of sad they never did a different version of Dracula for Angel, because the Angel television show, I feel, is superior to Buffy, and has the whole world that Angel lives in has a very different feel to it, and I would have loved to see a Dracula in that unit.
It would have made more sense going into the Angel backstory, too, when you find out this guy was the scourge of Western Europe, and especially during the years they said he was. I believe it starts in the 1600s when Liam was turned into Angel, Angelus, and kind of started wreaking havoc with Darla as, his sire. And just, the Dracula character has been around since, God, I believe, he's said to have existed since the days of Vlad the Impaler, if it is indeed Vlad the Impaler, which would take you back to, very primitive Wallachia. And certainly there was some point he could have crossed paths with Angelus in Europe, or even in, bringing him back into the main, continental United States at some point, like they did with Buffy. Why couldn't you have him interact with Angel, too, in Los Angeles, the way they had so many other monsters react to them?
Okay, now, one of the other reasons I wanted to do this particular topic about now is, well, for one, over at The Long Road to Ruin, they just did the Twilight series with Mark Radulich, his wife, Melissa, and, of course, Sean Comer. So we're kind of made a vampire week out of the last couple of weeks. I also wanted to specifically talk about, and I'm not sure if you're interested in this at all, but the upcoming Dracula television series. Are you aware of this? Am I going to be going by myself for a couple of minutes here talking about this? It's scheduled to go later this year and go into 2014. Are you aware of anything with that as far as that goes? You want to talk about, are you leery of that? Are you anxious for it? I mean, your thoughts on that?
I'm extremely leery of it. I've seen the previews. I tend to read the trades whenever I see them. Our site, 411 Mania, always posts some type of news regarding it, usually at least once a month, because it's been very slow in development, to say the least, and constantly has been shifted around as far as its debut. I'm always leery of a television version of, a character like Dracula, because it's very easily mishandled in a lot of ways, where they tend to make him more of an anti-hero or a romantic force than the character's true nature, and you get turned off by that. Did you happen to follow the series that aired in the very early 90s? It only ran for 2 years. Dracula, the series, which followed Dracula as a European businessman who was dealing with Gustav Helsing as his main antagonist and Gustav's 2 American nephews from Philadelphia.
I did not see any of that particular one. I'm aware of its existence, but I haven't bothered to track it down.
Yeah, I actually found it at a Coconuts video when those still existed on DVD, used for $6 a piece, both seasons, and grabbed them. It was kind of a fun portrayal of Dracula, and while the series was a little bit tongue-in-cheek and aimed at a younger audience, because it's, 3 of the main characters were young teens in the show, the portrayal of Dracula was very good. He was absolutely the villain. He was a European businessman named Alexander Lucard, who ran a multimedia conglomerate and had accumulated vast wealth through the years, and constantly found out changed his identity. But that was a smart take on him to a not that smart audience. So it made sense in the context, and it was fairly well done. This series I'm very apprehensive of for a number of reasons. One of them being that, the recent vampire craze is mainly due to the Twilight portrayal of vampires. That works for Twilight, and that's fine. That's not what you want to see from the Prince of Darkness. And so immediately I'm very leery of that, and my main belief is that any vampire movie that's come out since then, I've always had to kind of be very apprehensive about being excited for, because I always feel like they're going to portray it more as a Twilight continuation than they would being true to the character's nature. So right away I'm apprehensive there. And the other reason is because it's been so shifted around and pushed back. And at times there will be a month where you hear news on the series almost daily, and then 2 months will go by and you hear nothing. So I'm not totally committed to thinking this is going to be awesome.
Well, I was leery just because, I mean, there have been a couple of decent vampire-themed television shows over the year. My parents and I kind of grew up watching, my parents were grown, obviously, but Forever Night, which I still enjoy. There was a Canadian television series, something about blood. I can't remember the title. But there have been some decent ones. There have also, there have been some bad ones, and a lot of Dracula hinges not just on the writing, but also on the actor. And I believe they have Jonathan Rhys Meyers set to play this particular version of Dracula. And for anyone who hasn't seen him, and I am not familiar with much of his work.
Is this the same guy from The Tudors?
Yes. So that's what he's most well known for. The only thing I've actually seen him in was one of the guys from Mission Impossible 3. I haven't seen The Tudors yet. Read the series, I just haven't been interested in it. So, does that help you at all? Does that make you more leery? Does it give you a notion of comfort?
It doesn't really do anything to reassure me one way or another. I saw a couple episodes of The Tudors. My cousin was actually very big on the show and loved it while it was on Showtime. I caught episodes here and there. I thought it was an okay show, but the thing is, the role he was playing is very not Dracula. So it's not always a good barometer to tell whether or not he's going to be fine in this role. Some guys do well with certain types of parts, and they completely flop in others. Not everybody can be Robert De Niro and be a chameleon, or Gary Oldman, for reference, and be able to do pretty much any and everything. So I know he's got experience at least. I know he knows what it's like to be the central character of a series and have to have the weight of the series put on him. Hopefully that leads to him taking the role very seriously and doing it justice, but it's not a big reassuring factor to me.
Oh, fair. I mean, I think personally I'd be less leery if NBC wasn't doing Hannibal, because the amount of violence and gore, to be fair, there's not a lot, but there's not a lot of gore as far as, when you understand gore. But there's a lot of violent content on the television series Hannibal, which, to be fair, as there should be. Hannibal Lecter without blood and violence is just not Hannibal Lecter, I feel. And, they've caught some heat for it because there's a fair amount of it. And if they didn't already have that, kind of stigma going with them into a Dracula television series, I'd be more inclined to go, okay, they're not afraid to push the envelope a little bit. They've got a show that's pushing the envelope. Do you push it a little further with a different show, or do you rein back? I mean, let me put it like this. If this was on AMC, I wouldn't worry about it. I mean, if the people at AMC were behind a Dracula show, I'd be excited. I'd be happy because they can get away with more as far as what they can put on television, as opposed to a major broadcaster like NBC can. I mean, you get more, just for a frame of reference, you get more violence and gore out of your average episode of The Walking Dead than you did through all of World War Z, for those of you who haven't seen it. It's safe, for my money, it's safe enough to take, kids to. My whole family saw it together. I have two brothers who are just barely teenagers, and no problem at all. There's very little blood or violence. I mean, I don't recall seeing any off the top of my head. And, again, so if it's a network that can push some stuff onto the airwaves, I'm a little less leery about it because they'll be able to at least do the character justice. And that's not, and again, if you're doing Dracula, you can do him different ways and he can still be Dracula. I'm leery that they're going to turn Dracula into a Twilight vampire, essentially, and to me that's not Dracula. I mean, I would almost be interested if someone did a version of Dracula within the Twilight universe, just kind of to see how that would play, but, there's a difference between Dracula in a different universe and turning Dracula into something to fit a notion as far as that goes. So that's my thoughts on that. Anything that we left out, any other video games, books, short stories, comics that you want to touch on right now?
I mean, he's in everything. There's no escaping Dracula in the pop culture milieu. You can read countless novels, you can watch TV, you can watch movies, you can go through role-playing games, any medium is going to have some kind of reference or frame of reference for Dracula, because he's so ingrained in pop culture and has been such an enduring character that you can find him in anything. I personally, as a kid, enjoyed the movies. I enjoyed the Tomb of Dracula comic series from Marvel that kind of did a good job, explaining all the years that movies don't touch on with him, and various adventures with other pop culture characters. I mean, it's pretty surreal to see Dracula trading blows with the X-Men and the Mighty Thor, but you get to see that through the magic of Marvel Comics. It's another thing to see him matching wits with Batman through DC, and Sherlock Holmes through novels, and the Puritan adventurer Solomon Kane, and all these characters that he's come across. It's almost a rite of passage for a character once they become established that they'll cross paths with Dracula or a Dracula clone at some point. And he's become the barometer, really, for what a great villain is, and still nobody's really truly measured up to him as becoming that definitive villain. You have great villains throughout several areas. You've got your Darth Vaders, your Terminators, all these great villains, but everything still, even when the monster movies have died out, they will always attempt to make Dracula movies work because he's such an endearing character, because he's the ultimate bad guy to the point where people want to always see a Dracula movie because they'll root for him to be killed, but they know that if the character ever truly stops being produced in books, movies, and everything, that the fun's over.
Well, I said it at the top of the show, and I absolutely meant it, that he is the most well-known, the most prolific, and the best villain just across pop culture or any other culture by and large. He's everywhere, and anybody can be successful with Dracula if it's done properly. And you can't say that about a lot of other bad guys, other characters, other things of that particular nature. I mean, wait, are you kidding me? There's a version of Dracula played by Judd Hirsch that I haven't seen. Oh my gosh, I am missing out. I got to find this thing.
It was a very, very not so great TV movie, and I believe 1987, done through Disney, ironically enough.
Yeah, the Halloween that almost wasn't, or Dracula Saved the World, apparently.
Yeah, Alex Rieger himself, Judd Hirsch, Dear John, you know him from several TV shows, wonderful actor, plays a version of Dracula who is apparently from not Transylvania, maybe
he's a New York
Queens.
Jew, right?
Yeah. maybe Regal Park in Queens. But yeah, it wasn't exactly the best portrayal, and I think probably the less said about it, the better. Every actor has a down point in their life, and that might have been Judd Hirsch's because it was in between Taxi and Dear John, so we'll give him a pass.
I almost have to see that just to see Judd Hirsch play Dracula, just for the absurdity
of finding it because it's very difficult.
Oh man! All right. Any other? I mean, he's, like you said, he's everywhere in every particular medium. Are there any other versions that you want to touch on before we close out? We're going to end a tad early, I think, but no harm, no foul there. So, any other, thoughts on Dracula? Maybe actors you'd like to see play Dracula in a setting, or just anything that we haven't touched on as far as this goes that you want to touch on before we go into closeout mode here.
I always thought that if I could have had somebody play Dracula and really done the character some interesting justice, I would have always liked to see Jack Nicholson have played him when he was a few years younger. Jack Nicholson is just such can be so sleazy, but in a good way, an entertaining way, and he knows it. Those eyebrows make him look inherently evil. The closest role he ever got to this was playing the devil in The Witches of Eastwick. But I think if he would have gotten to play Dracula at some point, it would have been so much fun from start to finish, and he probably would have just rocked it.
Yeah, that's a shame that he never got to play it as far as I know. I mean, we could be wrong about that. Any contemporary actors that you'd like to see take it on? I mean, it's easy to kind of fantasy cast Heath Ledger now that he's passed on, but...
Wow, okay. Guns blazing on that one.
No, I mean,
know what?
I'm only being quasi-facetious there.
As long as you kept Tim Burton out of the mix, I think that could be a role that Johnny Depp could actually succeed with if you had
Johnny
the right
Depp can't
team
be in a movie without Tim Burton.
You know what? Tim Burton has ruined what was once one of the better actors of our generation by just constantly putting him in crap and convincing him it's a good idea. But I think if Johnny would have gotten away from Tim Burton, it could have been good. He seems to have a lot of the positive qualities that people who played Dracula would have worked with. I think he could have done well. As far as like the new generation, the new crop of actors who are up and coming, unfortunately, nobody's really springing to mind immediately. Maybe Henry Cavill.
He could be Superman and Dracula.
I just thought he had a good presence in Man of Steel, and he has the right kind of look where he can be imposing, but still, can lure you in with a false sense of security. I thought, there's a shot maybe he could do something like that.
Yeah, I really liked him in Man of Steel. But I also liked him in Immortals when he played Perseus. Not a very good movie, but I enjoyed his performance as far as that went. No, but, that's also the point of them being actors. We can fantasy cast all we want. At the same time, I don't think anybody would have pictured, like Chris Evans as Captain America, and he did a great job with it. Or, to go back to what I said earlier, Heath Ledger as the Joker, that raised a lot of eyebrows, and, look what happened. That was pure magic with him and Nolan working together. And that pretty much wraps up anything I would have to say about Dracula. I can't think of any other versions or whatnot that I want to hit on, so... Anything going on with you, Pat? What's going on with you this week? When's your comic book podcast coming up?
Hardy har.
Not letting it go.
No, not letting it go. I may even end up doing a one-man broadcast just to get it off the ground so we can stop having a question asked by Robert, whenever I guest star on the show and whenever Radulich wants to bring it up on the 411 Ground and Pound radio show that airs every Sunday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time except for last Sunday because we were all busy watching Money in the Bank. But, we're working on that. Working on producing a stand-up comedy special that I am putting blood, sweat, and tears into daily. Hopefully I can get it off the ground by next year and really have it polished and well done, and I can find the space to do it with. Kind of a goal I've had in mind for a long time, and finally putting the work into it to get it down.
I wish you good luck with that. Stand-up comedy's not easy, and there has to be some inherent respect for anyone who gets up there and does their routine. Unless you're Jamie Kennedy, in which case, please shoot. I kid. I give Jamie Kennedy a hard time. But he's infinitely less offensive than other stand-up comics and actors. Not his movies. His movies have been pretty much universally awful, but him as a stand-up and him as a person, there are many people who I would throw stuff at. I don't think he's... Oh, nice. Okay, so nothing else coming up? You planning on returning to write for 411 anytime soon? We got an open slot.
Actually, I gotta see what the next 2 weeks unfold like, and potentially at that point I could come back into the 411 fold, provided the stars align and Larry Zonka's still on board. So hopefully we can get something going with that real soon.
Well, I look forward to you coming back. We got a bunch of new writers, all of them very good. It's just, we can always use more talented writers. Speaking of, anybody listening, if you want to write about MMA, entertainment, professional wrestling, games, music, look at 411mania.com. We're usually looking for writers. No, we don't pay, but a couple of people have access to the private jet every now and then, even though Jeff Harris has been hogging it lately. As for me, tomorrow Locked in the Guillotine will be up. I was going to take another look at Anderson Silva, but since everybody else has been doing that, I decided against it. Instead, you'll get some discussion of news and some things I would like to see changed in the world of MMA, specifically in the UFC. I will be on this Sunday's 411 Ground and Pound radio show. Airs 9 p.m. Eastern every Sunday, more or less, at 9 o'clock Eastern. That's going to do it for me.
7 o'clock Mountain Time, folks.
I live in Mountain Time. It's 7 o'clock Mountain. That's going to do it for me for probably about a week and a half. I am flying out to Missouri to help my dad move, because I'm the good son and I do that type of stuff. So I'll be doing that. So there won't be an episode of Everyone Loves a Bad Guy next week. I know, it's very sad, but I'm sure you'll all get over it. I've missed weeks before, and
we're going to have to find a way to get along without you.
Yes, I'm sure you will. Mark Radulich might take this over for 1 week just to screw with me and give me a bad name, because I'm beating him out on listens. I told you, my Hannibal Lecter solo podcast has right about 700 listens right now, and he hasn't come close to that number in a long time, so haha, Mark, if you're listening. I'm still beating you. But yeah, I'll be gone, so there won't be one of these next week, and odds are there will not be a Locked in the Guillotine column, just because I'll be helping my dad move. That should take all total, probably about a week and a half to 2 weeks. I also have to finish writing my blurbs for the upcoming section in the MMA zone. And I'm trying to maybe I'm not a real MMA fan, but I just can't get into the Eddie Alvarez versus Michael Chandler fight. Maybe I'm just a horrible person. I don't know. All right, we're going to end a couple of minutes early, but since I've run over every other time, we'll call that a win for this one. So for Pat Mullin, who may be returning to 411 Mania shortly, and as he mentioned, you can hear every Sunday evening, 9 p.m. Eastern, on the 411 Ground and Pound radio show. I'm Robert Winfree. I told you last time I'd have a sound clip to close us out. I have a sound clip to close us out. I'll see you in a couple of weeks, everybody. Have a good night.
So say good night to the bad guy.